When the news spread that Phil Robertson had passed away, his family braced themselves for grief, but not for the silence that followed. It wasn't the loud kind of heartbreak people expect when a public figure dies. It was heavy, still, and deeply personal. Phil was a man who lived simply, spoke plainly, and believed firmly, and those closest to him thought they understood what he would leave behind. They expected memories, faith, and perhaps a straightforward farewell. What they didn't expect was how carefully he had prepared for this moment. When the family gathered after his passing, they discovered that Phil had left more than instructions. He had left words, handwritten words, thoughts shaped by reflection, love, and an awareness that his time was limited. In that quiet space, they realized his final act wasn't about death at all. It was about guiding them forward, long after his voice was gone. The slow goodbye no one was ready for. In the months leading up to May 2025, the Robertson family faced a reality they were never prepared to accept. Phil Robertson, the man they had always known as physically strong and emotionally steady, began to fade. When the family shared in late 2024 that he had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, many assumed time was still on their side. Inside the home, however, the changes came faster than anyone expected. At first, it was small moments, misplaced items, repeated stories, pauses where certainty once lived. Soon, confusion replaced routine. Conversations became exhausting, and simple tasks required help. Phil's body weakened alongside his memory, and the man who once thrived outdoors now needed rest after speaking. Still, he remained calm, even accepting. He spoke often of death without fear, reminding his children that life, to him, was part of something much bigger. A final mourning. At home. In the early hours of May 25th, 2025, Phil Robertson passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by his family. He was 79. There were no dramatic moments, no urgency, just a quiet goodbye that reflected the way he lived. His son Jace shared the news first, followed by messages from Willie and Corey, who expressed both sorrow and gratitude. They spoke not only of loss, but of thankfulness for the years they were given. Phil had often told his family not to mourn loudly when he was gone, encouraging them to sing and celebrate instead. But when the moment arrived, those words proved harder to follow than expected. Grief came naturally. The funeral that followed was private and modest, just as Phil would have wanted. There were prayers, shared memories, and tears that no one tried to hide. But the hardest moment was still ahead. The envelope that changed everything. The day after the funeral, the family gathered in a lawyer's office in West Monroe to hear Phil's final instructions. Miss Kay sat beside her children, joined by Phyllis, the daughter Phil had discovered later in life, and welcomed fully into the family. What they expected was a legal reading. What they received was deeply personal. Phil had written individual letters to each family member by hand. The writing was uneven, shaped by illness, but unmistakably his. These were not just explanations of inheritance. They were reflections, apologies, encouragements, and blessings. Each letter explained not only what he was leaving behind, but why. He spoke about responsibility, faith, and the importance of remembering where they came from. As each envelope was opened, the room grew quieter. This was not a man distributing wealth. This was a father preparing his family for a future without him. More than money, a meaningful legacy. Phil Robertson's estate was substantial, built over decades through business, writing, and public speaking. Estimates placed its value between $10 and $15 million, but the numbers were never the focus. Miss Kay received ownership of the family home they had built together through hardship and faith. Alan was entrusted with Phil's religious writings, a symbol of shared conviction. Jace and Jep were given responsibility within the family business, not as reward, but as guardians of tradition. Phyllis received land and a deeply personal note acknowledging lost years and shared healing. Willie inherited the controlling stake in Duck Commander, along with a message emphasizing stewardship over success. By the time the final letter was read, tears filled the room. The family realized that Phil's greatest concern was not how his money would be spent, but how his values would be carried forward. That understanding made the loss feel even heavier. Roots built in the Louisiana swamps. To understand the weight of Phil Robertson's final words, one must understand where he began. Long before television or success, Phil grew up in deep poverty in rural Louisiana. Hunting was not recreation, it was survival. Meals depended on what he could bring home from the swamp, and that upbringing shaped his independence and resilience. Though he later earned a football scholarship and became a starting quarterback at Louisiana Tech, he walked away from the sport, choosing a life closer to the land over fame. That decision defined him. In the early 1970s, he turned his skill into Duck Commander, handcrafting duck calls from home, while Miss Kay supported their growing family. For years, they lived with very little, relying on faith and perseverance. The empire that eventually followed was not built overnight. It was built through sacrifice, patience, and unity. Values Phil believed mattered more than wealth itself. Fame that brought both opportunity and weight. When Duck Dynasty premiered in 2012, the Robertson family entered a world none of them had planned for. What began as a simple show quickly became a cultural phenomenon, drawing millions of viewers. Phil's straightforward personality stood out, and his words often sparked conversation far beyond entertainment. While some admired his consistency and faith, others disagreed strongly with his views. Phil never saw himself as a public figure chasing approval. He believed in speaking honestly, even when it invited criticism. Over time, the attention placed pressure on the family, and fame brought challenges alongside opportunity. The show eventually ended, though its influence remained. Later projects followed, and plans for a revival were announced in 2025. Phil would not appear due to his health, but his presence remained central. His convictions, for better or worse, shaped the family's public identity and the responsibilities they now carry. A life marked by change and redemption. Before success and recognition, Phil Robertson faced years of personal struggle. He spoke openly about mistakes made in his early adulthood, including periods of anger, addiction, and absence from his family. Miss Kay carried the weight of those years with remarkable strength, holding the household together when stability felt impossible. Phil's turning point came through faith, an experience he described as transformative. From that moment, he dedicated himself to rebuilding what had been damaged. He worked to restore trust with his wife and children, grounding his life in responsibility and belief. That change became the foundation of everything that followed, from business decisions to public speaking. Even in his final months, as illness took hold, his sense of purpose remained intact. The family understood that the legacy he left was shaped not by perfection, but by growth accountability, and the willingness to change. The end of an era for the family. Phil Robertson's passing marked more than the loss of a husband and father. It marked the close of a chapter in the Robertson family story. He represented a generation defined by self-reliance, tradition, and deep-rooted belief. As his health declined, fans prepared for the inevitable. But the speed of his illness still came as a shock. In his final weeks, Phil recorded a handful of podcast episodes, his voice steady despite his condition. Those recordings now feel like a farewell. The private funeral reflected who he truly was, quiet, grounded, and focused on family. In the days that followed, responsibility shifted. Willie stepped into greater leadership, Jace continued the podcast, and the next generation prepared to carry the family story forward. Phil's absence was undeniable, but his influence remained present in every decision they made. What Phil left behind that truly mattered. As the family reflected on the letters in the will, one truth became clear. Phil Robertson did not measure his life by success or recognition. He measured it by faithfulness, effort, and family. The money he left behind was important, but it was never the point. His final message was about identity, reminding his children who they were and what they stood for. He asked them to protect what they built, not just financially, but spiritually and relationally. The tears that followed the reading were not about inheritance. They were about responsibility and love. Phil had spent his final days preparing his family not for loss, but for continuity. In that sense, his death did not end his presence. It transformed it. The man who lived by his convictions left behind something lasting, not just a fortune, but a roadmap for those who came after him.